the gun debate, and economic challenges. The nation on edge.
My fellow Americans, enough. Let's hear the call and the cry. Let's meet the moment. Let us finally do something.
As President Biden calls on Congress to pass new gun laws.
He began firing at anyone that was in his way.
And more horrific mass shootings, including in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
I think I've got partners at the table right now who have a lot of credibility in the Republican caucus, and that makes me feel good about our chances.
Hopefully, we can find a way to come together and make some progress on this horrendous problem, consistent with our Constitution and with our values.
But out of the darkness comes hope that a bipartisan deal on guns could pass the Senate. Plus, ahead of the midterms, the White House tries to pivot its messaging on inflation and the economy. But will the strategy work? Next.
This is Washington Week. Corporate funding is provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Ku and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, moderator Yamiche Alcindor.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. Across the country, there is shock and frustration. Since the massacre in Buffalo 3 weeks ago, there have literally been more mass shootings than there have been days. To be exact, since May 14th, there have been at least 37 mass shootings in this country. That's according to the nonprofit Gun Violence Archive. One of those was on Wednesday in Tulsa, Oklahoma. There, a gunman walked into a medical building and allegedly killed 4 people and himself. And in Uvalde, Texas, funerals have begun for the 21 students and teachers who were shot to death at Robb Elementary School last week. In a primetime speech, President Biden addressed the nation.
After Columbine, after Sandy Hook, after Charleston, after Orlando, after Las Vegas, after Parkland, nothing has been done. This time that can't be true. This time we must actually do something. For God's sake, how much more carnage are we willing to accept? How many more innocent American lives must be taken before we say enough, enough?
Meanwhile, a bipartisan group of lawmakers working to hammer out some sort of gun reform bill say a, quote, framework for a deal is close. Joining me tonight to discuss this and more, Eugene Daniels, Playbook author and White House correspondent for Politico, and Annie Karni, congressional reporter for the New York Times. There's so much going on. I want to start, of course, with you, Eugene, because there was this primetime speech. President Biden laid out so many things that he wants to see happen. But what's the sense inside the White House of how much the president can really influence Congress to pass something?
Yeah, what you saw yesterday was the president talking to a bunch of different audiences. First was members of Congress, who he was saying, these are the things I want to do. And this is a list that we've heard from him when he was heading up the gun task force during the Obama administration after Sandy Hook. So talking about a ban on assault rifles, talking about assault weapons, talking about a registry, talking about red flag laws, these kinds of things that have a lot of bipartisan support among voters. And then also, more importantly, talking to the American people and channeling their frustration. The administration thinks that it went well at the White House. When you talk to them, they think that the speech did what it was supposed to do. But the problem is, and the thing that you did not hear, was executive action that he is thinking of doing. That's because the sense in the White House is that they've done a lot of what they can do, and their hands are tied when it comes to the executive action that they have left. They've done, I think, 4 different tranches of executive action on guns and gun control and gun safety laws, but they can't do much more. And that's where they are now worried as they watch members of Congress go through what we've seen over and over and over again, which is a bipartisan effort come together, hope that something might happen, and then kind of waiting on pins and needles to see if it actually does.
And Annie, the president at one point said, I've told you what I want to do. And he said, the question now is, what will Congress do? Of course, that's squarely on your beat. All eyes are on these bipartisan lawmakers. What more do we know about the framework that they say they're close to or have sort of settled on? And really, is this going to happen?
It looks like people are optimistic that something is going to happen. Senator Cornyn from Texas made a statement to Politico saying it would be embarrassing if we got nothing done. And that was seen by advocates, by a lot of people watching closely, as a really strong statement from a Republican like Cornyn to make, indicating that something will happen. Now, the question is, how modest is it going to be? And most Democrats have been burned so many times before in this kind of debate and assume that it will be quite modest, that it won't be lowering the age to buy an assault weapon, something modest on background checks, something on red flag laws. But modest is also getting something done to show that legislation can pass in the Senate. There can be 60 votes, and the sky doesn't fall in. And they think it'll start chipping away at the inability to do anything. And what I really am struck by is that there's broadly this sense of every time one of these tragedies happens, nothing's going to change. And yet among Democrats working on the issue, among the activists in this world, they are optimistic. They take a long view, and they think that something that's going to look quite small potentially actually matters quite a bit. But modest is kind of the best hope here.
And it's really interesting that you say it, because I remember covering Newtown, Connecticut, and the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School. I thought the world was going to change. I now think of that as a decade ago as a naive reporter, because of course nothing changed. But it does seem like you said this time is a little different. I do want to go to you, Eugene, because in Playbook today, you pointed out that in February 2020, President Biden had this gun speech when he was hoping to win Nevada, and when he was sort of down and needing to win in the primaries in 2020. And then he pledged that he was going to have this gun legislation on his first day in office, and then it didn't happen. Connect that February 2020 speech to the pressure the president is feeling now.
Yeah, because he made a lot of promises on the campaign trail. We all remember all of the Democrats did, because they were thinking about how can we possibly beat Donald Trump. You have to get not just the base, which is black voters, and they're a little bit more moderate. You have to get liberals very excited to vote. And so that's what they did. He made very large promises on what he was going to be able to do with gun legislation, and not knowing that he was going to have 50 Democratic senators to do something, if anything, on pieces of legislation. And so now, as you watch different constituencies that are really important to the administration, whether that is gun control advocates, whether that is civil rights groups because of issues like what happened in Buffalo, all of those different groups are pushing and talking to the administration, asking, what are you doing? And like I said, they've done a lot of the executive action they feel like they can do, but they wanted to see President Biden get out there more. He hasn't been super involved in the negotiations on what's happening with the bipartisan effort, wanting to give the senators time and space to do that. It's not always helpful for a president to jump in and try to help negotiate a bipartisan effort, but that was giving advocates a little pause about what he was going to be able to do.
And I want to follow up, because there have been more than 200 mass shootings this year. Polling shows that Americans over and over again say that they are open to backing things like changes in background checks. Does the White House have a sense that this is going to change things, that there's that all of this sort of cultural things and the polling, that's kind of giving this sense of urgency that something will really be done?
Yeah, I think they're hopeful, you know what I mean? But they, just like all of us, watched Sandy Hook happen and nothing happened. A lot of the folks that are working at the White House now were working for either Vice President Biden or working somewhere in the administration at that time. So they've been burned before on this issue. And so when you talk to folks, what they say is they're encouraged by what they're seeing. They're not thinking something huge is going to happen, but they're hopeful that if you look at, you break a little crack in the dam, and then you have some flooding rush in, and you have a little bit of changes happening. And Senator Chris Murphy, who's leading this for Democrats, he's been telling reporters that if I can just get my, Republican colleagues to realize that the world is not going to end if we get something done on legislation, maybe we can do this again.
And Annie, the crack in the dam, I like that metaphor, because in some ways it is sort of, if they can just get a little thing done, then maybe it'll overflow. I'm also really interested in asking you about this. I was thinking about it all day, and I was like, I can't wait to talk to Annie about this. And it's the House bill. There's a bill happening. It's going forward. what's the point of it if we know it's going to not be passed in the Senate?
Well, it's still important to show support. And now the House bill, there's a passed bill that Senator Schumer now has to decide next week. Like, he has to give them space to have these negotiations, and he has to decide, like, am I going to bring up that House bill for a vote? Or I have to bring at some point, if there's not going to be a compromise, I'm going to bring a vote, and it can be a show vote. He's had many, the Congress does this a lot, a vote that they know will fail, but it has to show where everyone stands. Yeah. And they think, 70% of this country supports background checks, and Republicans will have to stand there and vote no for something that has broad popular support. So, and I think it's just important for, the House can pass a bill like that. Why wouldn't they? And then say it's on to you, to the Senate, to take some action. There's a bill there waiting for them to vote on if it comes to that. Yeah. I think next week, the real question for Schumer will be, do we have to take a vote on a bill we know is going to fail? Or is this bipartisan group going to come up with a framework? Obviously, they'd rather pass legislation than have a show vote.
And another question that I had for you, Representative Chris Jacobs is this Republican who represents a district that is 10 miles from where Buffalo, New York, where that massacre happened, where 10 Black people were killed. He came out and said that he actually was in support of a federal assault weapons ban. And then now he faced a lot of GOP backlash, and he's no longer running for re-election. Tell me a little bit about what he's going through, tells us about the political stakes that Republicans are facing.
I think he lasted 7 days after coming out against, for gun control efforts, and now today, the story broke that he is not running for re-election anymore. I mean, that should temper anyone who's feeling incredibly hopeful right now about the party, where the Republican Party is, the control that the NRA still has, even in a diminished state, over Republican lawmakers. There's no grade that's more important to a lot of people. There's no issue that defines the party so much as the Second Amendment, that just states the feeling about government, the feeling about free independence and your own rights as this issue. So, it's a cautionary tale for anyone feeling like we watched the slaughter of school children, and now there's going to be some big moment, and you just look at what happened 7 days after coming out for gun control efforts. He's out of the race.
And but despite all of the popular support that we all know and we all talk about every time there's one of these shootings, there's not a lot of political incentive for Republicans to do that. Obviously, he's a perfect example. But when you talk to voters about what's going to take them to the polls, things like gun control and abortion do not rise to the levels that Democrats or people who want to see these things change would want. It's about the economy. It's about inflation.
Well, Eugene, you basically wrote what my turn is to the next to our next subject, because it is the economy, as you just said. Inflation is at a 4-decade high, and rising prices at grocery stores and gas stations are hitting Americans so hard. With 6 months to go until the November elections, the midterms, of course, the administration is trying to shift its messaging on inflation and the economy. Earlier this week, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen admitted on CNN that a year ago she was incorrect when she said inflation would be, quote, transitory. She told the network, quote, "I think I was wrong then about the path that inflation would take." All that said, there is, I should say, some good news. The May jobs report was better than expected, despite fears of an economic slowdown. Joining us now to discuss the state of the economy is Amara Omeokwe. She is an economics reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for being here. I want to start off with just where we are. You're an economics reporter. I'm so happy you're here because we really need an economics reporter to break this all down for us. Jamie Dimon is saying, who is, of course, I should tell people, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. He's saying that there's going to be an economic hurricane. Mothers, of course, aren't being able to find baby formula, but we also have this jobs report that looks better. So let's break down sort of where we are in the state of the economy and the horizon.
Well, the state of the economy is really sort of in a delicate place, right? There are a lot of bright spots. If you look at where we are in the labor market, for instance. We had a pretty solid jobs report today. If you look at where household balance sheets are, those are some of the positive signs in the economy. But of course, we have inflation, which, as you mentioned, is at a 4-decade high. It's really hitting families hard. And if you look at polling data and consumer sentiment data, Americans are really concerned about all these higher prices that they're seeing at the grocery store, at gas pumps. Like, it's a big problem for a lot of Americans. And then you also have the Federal Reserve, which is mounting this very aggressive campaign to lower inflation. They're raising interest rates, they're shrinking the size of their balance sheet. They're basically trying to tap the brakes on the economy. And that is what is giving corporate leaders and economists some pause. The fear is that the Federal Reserve won't be able to bring down inflation without launching us into a recession, basically, a really significant slowdown. So I think people are hopeful that hopefully, the Federal Reserve will be able to do it. But there is some fear among some that they won't be able to. And that's sort of a big headwind and a big question mark for the economy in the months to come.
And another big question, Amara, is what can President Biden actually do? There have been so many presidents, all the way from LBJ to Nixon to all these other presidents who tried to deal with inflation and failed. How much can he really impact the economy on his policies and his messaging?
Well, I mean, he's trying. The administration is trying. You saw them this week say that they're going to be engaging in sort of this month-long campaign during the month of June to speak to Americans about the economy, to try and reassure Americans that they have a plan to fight inflation. But if you talk to pretty much any economist, they will say, look, the president really can't do much. His administration really can't do much. Really, the most powerful player here is the Fed. And we just sort of have to wait for the Fed to make its move and see how those moves work through the system. But at the same time, from a political standpoint, it's basically impossible for the president and his administration to say, look, this is the Fed's responsibility. We're not going to do anything about it. So you do see them trying to reset on their messaging. You do see them talking about some of the things that they're trying to do, whether that be, a release from the energy reserves or trying to push Congress to pass some of President Biden's economic agenda. But if you talk to economists, they say those sorts of things really don't move the needle on inflation, particularly in the short term.
And Annie, this week began with President Biden writing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling on Congress to pass things like a clean energy tax credit or investments in tax reform. How much is Congress and really his fellow Democrats, how much are they interested in some of the things that the president's talking about?
There's a lot going on.
I love this answer, by the way.
I do think it's interesting that Biden has spent the week kind of tacking into, they have been trying for months being more optimistic about the inflation and the economy than the reality has been. And with Yellen saying she was wrong and the administration now trying to kind of tack and they have positive economic indicators like the jobs numbers that they've been trying to highlight, but now they're trying to really show that they're taking inflation issues more seriously. June is going to be an interesting month between the Roe decision coming out of the Supreme Court, gun vote in Congress, the January 6th hearings. This is going to be a big month for Democrats to try and convince voters that this is not just a referendum on the president and on Congress and Democrats in control of Congress, that this is a choice election, and that this is a big month where that will either happen or it won't.
Yeah. I was going to ask, Eugene, I want to ask you about sort of the challenges facing, but I have to, of course, ask you about Janet Yellen and her saying that she is wrong. What was going on there? Because she fell on her sword.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was something that we don't often hear, especially from this administration, because when you think about when inflation first started becoming evident, Jen Psaki, who was the press secretary at the time, kind of scoffed at the idea that it was going to stick around for a long time. And what they kept using and saying was that it was going to be transitory, which means it's not going to be around very long. That feels a lot different now, right? And so Janet Yellen going back and saying, I was wrong on this. That is something that was brought up to the current press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, this week. And basically were you guys wrong? And will you say that as well? And she was like, no, we're not. She just kept moving, kind of moving on and not saying that. But when you talk to the American people about this, what they've said is the whole time we felt like they weren't taking it seriously enough. President Biden was going out and he was giving speeches telling people, I feel your pain. But he kept talking about those economic indicators that you were just talking about that are good for this administration and for the country. But people weren't hearing that when their milk was expensive, when gas was going up. And now you have this issue of infant formula not being able to come to mothers and not being on shelves. So they're not feeling the same thing.
There are so many challenges. And Amara, I want to get your sense of what you thought about Janet Yellen's comments. And also, you told our producers that people sort of just feel sour right now around the country. So weigh in on sort of Janet Yellen's statements and how the way that people are feeling is also part of this.
Well, yeah, I agree with Eugene. It was sort of a rare moment of candor from the Treasury Secretary that you don't often hear from administration officials. But I think what you also heard her doing there is trying to explain why we have the inflation that we have right now. In those same comments, she said there were circumstances that couldn't have been foreseen last year that caused supply shocks to the economy that basically helped drive the inflation that we're seeing right now. And what I sort of heard her saying is basically like a pushback to the criticism that Republicans have been constantly launching at this administration, that it was actually their policies that fueled the inflation that we're seeing right now. What you hear her and other administration officials often doing is saying, look, there are a lot of reasons that we have inflation. Inflation is a global problem. We have these supply chain issues. So they're really trying to push back on that criticism from Republicans. Whether, all of this messaging resonates with voters and breaks through with voters, that just remains to be seen. As others on the panel said, the administration has been messaging on inflation for months, and we still see that in polling data and consumer sentiment data. People pretty much aren't buying it. They feel bad about where the economy is now. They feel bad about the outlook for the economy in months to come. So this really is a difficult position for the administration to find itself in.
And Eugene, going back to Annie's great point about just the confluence of challenge that this White House faces. Take us a little bit into how they're prioritizing, what they're dealing with, and just the overall mood in there. Because when I talk to folks, they sound like they're overwhelmed, but they also sound like, yes, this is what a White House has to deal with.
Exactly. Yeah, the mood is sour. It's sour outside in the country, and it's sour in the White House because there's so much going on. And the biggest problem, and we've been talking about this entire show, is that there's not much the White House can do for some of these issues on inflation, on guns, on all some of these things that the American people want them to do. There's not much for them to do. So
and they also said, I should also say that aides also said that they didn't tell President Biden about the baby formula issue until April. They're also walking back some of his statements on Taiwan. There's just sort of this frustration, it seems like.
Yeah, there's like a flurry of kind of what seems like and feels like missteps, right? Especially when you talk to the administration, you say, why wasn't the president briefed on baby infant formula when the people who make it knew that the closing of the Abbott facility was going to be an issue immediately? Why didn't he know? And that's one of the many things that they're dealing with. And it is, the White Houses are hard. Running the country is very difficult. And at a time when people are feeling how they're feeling, this administration feels like they don't have a lot of things that they can do, but they're pushing forward. They talk about chewing gum and walking at the same time.
Yeah. Well, a lot of challenges to deal with. Thank you so much to Amara, Eugene, and Annie for joining us and for sharing your reporting. We'll continue our conversation on the Washington Week Extra. This week's topic, the January 6th committee hearings. Find it on our website, Facebook, and YouTube. And on Saturday on PBS News Weekend, Jeff Bennett looks at mass shootings and gun violence in America and what can be done to curb this growing problem. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week is provided by...
For 25 years, Consumer Cellular has been offering no-contract wireless plans designed to help people do more of what they like. Our U.S.-based customer service team can help find a plan that fits you. To learn more, visit consumercellular.tv.
Additional funding is provided by Ku and Patricia Ewen through the Ewen Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.